Hello, my name is Sarit Katan Griffiths. I'm an associate professor of theology in the theology department at Fordham University and the acting director of the Center for Jewish Studies. I want to welcome all of you virtually to our community, whether you're a regular at our events or this is your first time joining us, and to thank you for being here for today's talk by Hanan Mazeh. I also want to express my gratitude to Siobhan Verleza and Magda Tedder for all of their efforts to make our Jewish Studies events happen and run so smoothly. Before I introduce today's speaker, I want to invite you to our upcoming spring semester events. You can find more information and registration links on our blog and through our weekly newsletter. Our next event will take place on Monday, March 15th at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and will feature a lecture by Pratima Gopalakrishnan of Duke University titled "What is Maintenance and Why Does It Matter?" This talk will focus on the concept of maintenance, that is, food, clothing, and other provisions that are given to members of families who are labeled dependents. Pratima will explore the rich history of this term in cross-cultural perspective, analyze how it is used in particular ways in rabbinic texts, and discuss how studying this concept and practice teaches us about gender, labor, and relationships within the ancient Jewish household. I hope that you'll join me. I have placed the registration links for you to access in the chat. Today's event was originally scheduled to be an in-person lecture, back when Hanan planned to be in the New York area for the year. I'm happy, though, that Hanan is joining us from Jerusalem, and that even though we find ourselves in challenging circumstances, we're able to connect and learn together virtually. I do hope that we'll have a chance to host speakers and discuss ideas together with all of you in person one day in the not too distant future, even as we continue to make our programs accessible remotely as well. I'm thrilled to introduce Hanan Mazeh. Hanan is Kreitman Postdoctoral Fellow at the Department of History at Ben-Gurion University. His research interrogates textual and thematic developments in rabbinic literature as a key to deepen our understanding of rabbinic society in the first centuries CE within its cultural context. His particular interest lies with the Palestinian Talmud and questions of territory and relations between Jews and Gentiles in Roman Palestine. I first met Hanan when we were both fellows at the Einstein Center Chronoi in Berlin, working on conceptions of time in Jewish antiquity. In that vein, I want to personally recommend an article that Hanan recently published this year in the Jewish Quarterly Review titled "Built, Destroyed, and Built Again, Temple and History in Genesis Rabbah in Light of Christian Sources." The piece examines rabbinic and patristic texts that consider the destruction of the temple and its use it as part of their historical periodization of the past and future. Hanan incisively and persuasively identifies a fascinating rabbinic motif in which mythic imagery of temple history is divided into three stages: the era when the temple stood, the past; the era of its destruction, the present; and the era when it will be rebuilt, the future. Hanan demonstrates that in contemporary Christian sources, the temple's destruction also becomes a central moment in historical periodization, but in a different way, and considers how these interrelated yet distinct views of historical time teach us about the worlds the rabbis and church fathers constructed for themselves in relation to one another. I mention this article not only to encourage you to read it, but also to frame today's talk titled "The Land of Israel, or Syria Palestina, Reconceptualization of Territory in Rabbinic Literature." Today, rather than focusing on historical periodization, that is, the impulse to divide time into discrete periods and even label or name them, Hanan will focus on territorial conceptualizations, that is, efforts to divide space into separate spheres and to give particular spaces names. and statuses. For those who already read Hanan's article on periodization, this talk on territory will be a nice complement to it. And for those who haven't read it, it might be a nice follow-up piece to today's lecture. During and after Hanan's talk, please submit your questions through the Q&A button on the bottom of your Zoom screen. Hanan will speak for about 40 minutes, after which I'll have a chance to be in conversation with Hanan and to ask him some of your questions. If we don't manage to ask all submitted questions, we will be sure to share them with Hanan after the talk. So without further ado, I want to thank Hanan for being with us and for generously sharing his research with us. And I'm excited to learn from you today.
Thank you so much, Sarit, for inviting me. I remember and miss the time at the Einstein Center in Berlin, where our productive time, I should say, when I worked on my mentioned article and you worked on your recently published book. And back in the time where people could just sit together in the same room and share thoughts. And I had hopes that this lecture could be conducted in person, but I'm nonetheless very happy to be here virtually and to take part in the rich academic discussion at the Center for Jewish Studies at Fordham University that you have managed to lead so impressively, even aspiringly, I would say, despite the circumstances, this difficult times all over the world, in which I have had the opportunity to follow from afar. My talk today, as advertised, will deal with the question of Jewish territory. The way the rabbinic community in Roman Palestine perceived its territory, the land of Israel, is one of the central and intriguing aspects by which the this community's identity struggle is reflected. The region and its Jewish population have undergone dramatic changes under Roman rule and following the two big rebellions, including the devastation of Judea and a consequent Jewish gravitation northward to the Galilee, a process of urbanization and ethnic medley, and in a larger sense, the area being administratively and financially absorbed into the Roman East. However, despite these changes, and although this territory had lost its distinctly Jewish profile, administratively, demographically, and politically, it nevertheless retained special halakhic significance in various fields, especially in the realm of agricultural law. Thus, one can find in halakhic discussions a significant concern, both explicitly and implicitly, with regards to the concept of the land of Israel and the need to define, or rather redefine it. That is the topic of my current in-progress project, part of which I wish to present here today. I'm especially interested in the halakhic tools with which the rabbis construct a legal territory and its conceptual boundaries, and what we can learn from that about their complex situation. One of the recent studies addressing such issues is a recommended book by Eyal Ben Eliyahu, I have it here with me, Identity and Territory, Jewish Perceptions of Space and Antiquity. In his discussion about rabbinic literature, Eyal Ben Eliyahu generally characterizes, and rightfully so, three joint principles by which the boundaries of the land of Israel are defined in rabbinic eyes. The first is biblical accounts of the territory that was held by or that was promised to Israel. The second is the imperial administrative division of the region, of which, I should note, our knowledge to date is still limited. And the third is Jewish demographical dominance in specific areas. Ben Eliyahu also depicts the rabbinic land as being elastic. That is, that its boundaries may change as a result of changes in demography or in Roman administration. In this lecture, I want to take a closer look at some rabbinic sources that reveal, as I intend to show, a more complex and nuanced picture. For instance, not all sources depict the boundaries as being elastic, and even those that do may be dealing with different types of elasticity. When we compare these sources, and sometimes even when we dig into a single source in itself, we can find diverse theoretical models with regard to the definition of the land and its boundaries. Not always are these models completely separable. And in some cases, the textual processes characteristic of the rabbinic texts make the job even harder, as we shall see. However, comparing the different models, rather than trying to harmonize them as often done, reveals a fascinating, diverse collection of voices regarding these questions. My focus today will be on the halakhic status of the territory of Provincia, Syria, the dominant neighboring province in the north, of which rabbinic sources are particularly concerned. Syria, as richly described in the work of Maurice Sartre, for instance, was the center of gravity of the Roman East, in military, political, and administrative terms. Palestina, in particular, throughout the centuries and several administrative reforms along the years, had been subordinated to it in many ways. In contrast, from the Jewish halakhic perspective, the distinct territorial center to which Syria is adjunct is the land of Israel. This complex reality, from the eyes of the rabbis in the Galilee, presents a particularly interesting case in terms of core and periphery. In what follows, I wish to look at some of the sources in rabbinic literature from Palestine that deal with Syria's halakhic status, mostly from Tannaitic literature that was composed up through the 3rd century CE, and to a lesser degree from the Palestinian Talmud of the 3rd and 4th centuries. These texts deal with complicated issues of agricultural law, which are sometimes difficult even to specialists in rabbinic literature. Some of them have been discussed to different extents by scholars of rabbinic literature. In any event, our discussion here will avoid getting into some of the halakhic details and will focus on the general territorial structures that these sources display, especially with regard to Syria. I intend to show how between these sources we can find several theoretical models and sometimes identify developments over time in what seems to reflect a general effort amongst the rabbis in Palestine to define their complicated relationship to the territory in the north. Let me share the screen. Let us begin with two sources in the Tosefta that explicitly define the borders of the land of Israel. The first one is Tosefta SHEVI'IT 4:6, in which is the land of Israel from the river south of Kziv and beyond. This is a rather peculiar line in the Tosefta, halakhic context of which is unclear. It defines the point of entrance to the land of Israel when coming from the north on the coastal Roman road, the highway of the Roman East, and sets the border at the river south of Kziv, probably the Gaton River. Indeed, the city of Kziv appears as a border point in several other rabbinic sources. It is the last village on the coastal road when coming from the north, from the south, before the steep slope called the Ladder of Tyr. Here a picture from the south, a remarkable topographic landmark that marks the border between Israel and Lebanon in our days as well. It is assumed that the administrative border between Syria and Palestine, which we do not know to mark precisely, was somewhere in the vicinity. This source is also compatible with the more detailed description of the borderline in the famous Braita de Tchumin, another rabbinic source that is cited also in the Rehov inscription. In any case, let us note that our source does not specify what exactly is the status of the territory before arriving at Kziv. One may assume that it is considered chutz la'aretz, outside the land, but only as an inference from silence. We are thus left with some questions regarding this source and its context. Another source in the Tosefta, the only other source in rabbinic literature that explicitly defines the boundaries of the land of Israel in the general sense, presents a different image. Tosefta TERUMOT 2:12 states, which is the land and which is outside the land. All that slopes down from the Taurus Amanus and beyond is the land of Israel, from Taurus Amanus and outward outside the land. This source, which appears in several parallels in rabbinic literature, is a bit clearer than the previous one in that it explicitly defines both sides of the border, the land of Israel on the one side and Chutz La'aretz, outside the land, on the other. Still, here too, there is no indication of the halakhic issue under discussion, and we are left with a general definition, which is the land. However, the border point in this case is very far from Kziv, and it is set in the Taurus Amanus mountain range, in our day southern Turkey. These mountains, also a significant landmark, were a well-known border point in antiquity and were considered to be, for instance, the gate to Asia and the border between the Roman provinces of Syria and Cilicia. Thus, this source, despite also reflecting a look northward on the coastal high road, stretches the realm of the land of Israel much further, to the northern border of provincial Syria. In that sense, one may see here a significantly different view of the imagined Jewish territory in its part in Syrian space. This is perhaps a territorial fantasy of holding some kind of control, at least in terms of halakhic regulation, over the entire geopolitical region. We now turn to more complicated sources, which reflects more complex models that stand in contrast to the territorial dichotomy between the land and Chutz La'aretz. One of the most important sources in that regard is Mishnah SHEVI'IT 6:1, that deals with the prohibition on cultivating the land of Israel during the sabbatical year. There are three territories with regard to the sabbatical year. All that was held by those who came from Babylon, from the land of Israel and until Kziv, may not be eaten nor be cultivated. And all that was held by those who came up from Egypt, from Kziv until the river and until Amanam, in other versions of the Mishnah, Amanos or Amanas, that is the Amanos mountains, may be eaten, but may not be cultivated. From the river and from Amanam and forward, may be eaten and cultivated. This is a particularly interesting source that deserves close examination. First, let us note that this source does not define the land of Israel per se, but rather designates territories with regard to the prohibitions of the sabbatical year. It presents a gradual tripartite model based on two parameters into which we will not get here: the prohibition to cultivate the land, ne'evad, and the prohibition to eat the produce, ne'echal. The first territory is prohibited in both aspects, may not be eaten nor be cultivated. The second territory, the intermediate zone, is prohibited in cultivation, but is permitted in eating. The third territory is completely permitted, may be eaten and cultivated. The landmarks that demarcate these territories are three: Kziv and Amanos, that we have previously discussed, complemented by the river, Nahal, probably the Euphrates, the eastern border of provincial Syria. The first territory stretches from the land of Israel and until Kziv. The second is demarcated, as the YERUSHALMI rightfully spells out, between Kziv and Amanos to the north and up to the Euphrates in the northeast. The third territory is further on, outside the lines of the Euphrates and the Amanos range. Thus, this source presents a gradual image that may be understood with the focus on the status of provincial Syria. While Palestina is fully considered the land of Israel with regard to SHEVI'IT prohibitions, Syria is considered to be of partial value. We also may wonder what is the relationship between the gradual model in this source and the two borderlines that we have seen separately in the Tosefta. In other words, should we assume that this model is in fact a combination, A compromise between two existing sets of boundaries? Perhaps the other way around? There is no clear-cut answer to this question in this case, in my eyes. Be that as it may, there is more to this source than that. Aside from the geographical demarcation, the Mishnah also defines the first territory as all that was held by those who came from Babylon, and the second one as all that was held by those who came up from Egypt. This unusual terminology seems to provide an historiographical background to the geographical division that it accompanies. The inner territory, until Kziv, is explained as the line to which the Jewish population has reached since the return to Zion from Babylon, an era that carries on until the times of the rabbis themselves. The intermediate zone is explained to be the territory that was held by those who came up from Egypt, that is, the maximum reach of the biblical kingdom, perhaps in David's days. However, there is somewhat of a textual tension in the formulation of this Mishnah in that regard. First, the reach of the biblical kingdom does not exactly fit the specification in the Mishnah until the river and until Amanus. Second, the Jewish settlement in the days of the rabbis, all that was held by those who came up from Babylon, is still open to change, and in that sense, shouldn't be bound to Kziv specifically. Finally, we can see that the Mishnah abandons the historiographical terminology when it gets to the final part, from the river and from Amanam and forward, and remains only with the topographical one. That is to say, that the conjunction between the two components in the definition of the three territories, the geographical administrative one and the demographic historiographical one, is unsmooth, and we should therefore suspect that this source is a product of textual compound. Our suspicion grows significantly when we look at two parallel sources to this Mishnah. The first parallel is in Mishnah HALLAH 4:8, that deals with the obligation to set aside a portion of the dough for the priesthood in different areas, another obligation that is fully applicable only in the land of Israel. We shall read it without getting into all the complicated halakhic details. Rabban Gamliel says there are three territories with regard to HALLAH. From the land of Israel until Kziv, one HALLAH. From Kziv and until the river and until Amanam, two HALLAHs, one for the fire and one for the priest. The one for the fire has a measure. From the river and from Amanam and forward, two HALLAHs, one for the fire and one for the priest. The one for the fire does not have a measure. As we can see, this Mishnah designates the same three territories according to the landmarks we have seen: Kziv, the river, and Amanus. Clearly, there is a close connection between these two regulations regarding SHEVI'IT and HALLAH in these two Mishnayot. However, this Mishnah does not refer at all to the demographic historiographical terminology and to the criteria of the occupation by those who came from Babylon or Egypt. It therefore seems quite plausible that this component was not part of the original model, upon which Mishnah SHEVI'IT is also based. The second parallel is found in SIFRE DEUTERONOMY, a 3rd century Tanaitic midrash contemporary, more or less, to the Mishnah. This text cites a halakha which is very similar to our Mishnah in SHEVI'IT. Thus you say, any place that was held by those who came up from Babylon, from the land of Israel until Kziv, may not be eaten nor be cultivated. Those who came up from Egypt may be eaten but may not be cultivated. Neither these or these may be eaten and cultivated. The halakha that the midrash cites here is clearly some kind of version of the one in the Mishnah, based on the same division to three territories in terms of the two parameters, eating the fruit and cultivating the land. However, here we can see that the division is based on the demographic historiographical terminology, and only at one point do we find a mention of the geographic criterion, from the land of Israel until Kziv. It thus seems, I argue, that this source represents the mirroring perspective, and that here there is a textual addition in the opposite direction. The model in this version, traces of which could be found in a few other Talmudic sources as well, is a more dynamic one. Indeed, its title does not refer to 3 lands, that is, 3 designated lands, with regard to the sabbatical year. The boundaries are not bound to Kuziv, and further areas, if they are held by Israel, may turn to be a part of the land of Israel. To this point, we will get back shortly. The analysis of these sources and the comparison between them thus revealed 2 distinct models in rabbinic sources in defining space and boundaries with regard to sabbatical prohibitions, and particularly in defining the territory of Syria. The first model, which has been the basis of the Mishnah in SHEVI'IT and appears also in Mishnah HALLAH, divides the region using clear and well-known landmarks, Kziv, the river, and Amanos, in accordance with the estimated boundaries of provinces Syria and Palestina. The second model, a more dynamic one, is based on demographics and does not draw clear boundaries. In addition, we find a reciprocal textual influence between the 2 models in the formulation of these sources. A line from the Mishnah model was added to the SIFRE, and 2 lines from the SIFRE's model have been added to the Mishnah. Other rabbinic sources reveal some more interesting processes. First, many sources simply refer to a territory named Syria. For instance, the very next passage in the Mishnah SHEVI'IT, immediately following the one discussed above, states, in Syria, one may work with detached produce, but not with attached. They may thresh, winnow, tread, or collect into sheaves, but they may not harvest, nor cut the grapes, nor harvest the olives. Rabbi Akiva said a principle, all that is kind is permitted in the land of Israel may be done in Syria. The discussion here deals with different types of jobs in the agricultural process, ones that are done when the crop is still physically attached to the land, and others that are done after harvest. In contrast to the land of Israel, where both kinds are presumably prohibited, in Syria, those that are not directly connected to the land are permitted. We thus find here, in the very subsequent passage in the Mishnah, a separate attempt to define Syria's intermediate status with regard to SHEVI'IT prohibitions, not between eating and cultivating, but between different types of work, and to distinguish between Syria and the land of Israel. The territory here is called Syria, which we may assume refers to the province and is approximately compatible with the demarcated territory between Kziv, Amanos, and the river. However, the use of this coined term as a distinct halakhic category seems to reflect a process of standardization of this territory. This process could be best demonstrated, in my eyes, in another source, in Tosefta KELIM, part A, 1.5. In 3 ways is Syria equal to the land of Israel, and in 3 to outside the land. Its dirt impurifies as outside the land. And he who brings a writ of divorce from Syria is like one who brings from outside the land. And he who sells his slave to Syria is like one who sells to outside the land. 3 to the land of Israel, for he who purchases a field in Syria is like one who purchases in the suburbs of Jerusalem, and it is obligated in Tais and SHEVI'IT, and if one can enter it in purity, it is pure. This list is a collection of diverse halakhic aspects regarding Syria that appear elsewhere in rabbinic literature in some form. Its compilation, which deserves a discussion in its own right, reflects an attempt to consolidate the various halakhic principles that apply to Syria to a somewhat coherent system as an intermediate territory that is considered as the land of Israel in some ways, but as outside the land in others. So to this point, we have seen a taste of the diversity in rabbinic sources with regard to Syria as a halakhic territory, in terminology, in the territory's fundamental definition, and in different attempts to define its intermediate status. Aside of that, we have seen a general tendency to systemize the various principles in the different models, which is manifested in coining halakhic terms, collecting sources from different contexts, and in processes of textual influence between different models. In the remaining time, I wish to take a closer look at the notion of Jewish occupation as a criterion in defining the status of the land, and to focus on one particular meaningful principle in rabbinic sources that has to do with the status of Syria. As we have seen, some of the sources construct the territory as what was held by the Jewish population in the era since the return from Babylon. The question, to which the sources present diverse answers, is what is the kind of holding or occupation of the land that we are talking about? Some sources seem to deal with Jewish conquering or sovereignty or demographic control of an entire region or city. However, the model on which I wish to focus deals with private ownership. This model appears almost exclusively in the context of tithes obligations, and it has been discussed to some extent by scholars, most notably by Saul Lieberman, who did exaggerate, in my mind, its extent. The fundamental idea, according to this model, is that the status of the land in Syria is dependent upon the ethnos of its owner. Land that belongs to an Israelite is considered, in terms of tithes obligations, as being part of the land of Israel, whereas land that belongs to a Gentile is considered chutz la'aretz, outside the land. Let us look at one source that illustrates this concept. An Israelite and a Gentile who purchase together a field in Syria. They are considered as untithed and tithed produce, which are mixed together. Those are the words of Rabbi. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, the Israelite's portion is obligated, the Gentile's portion is exempted. In this passage, the two rabbis discuss a case of partnership between an Israelite and a Gentile in Syria, and debate whether the produce should be obligated in tithes or not. They disagree of what would be the adequate solution in the unique case such a partnership presents. But we should note, as Lieberman has pointed out, that the underlying assumption, questioned by neither of them, is that in principle, a land of an Israelite in Syria would be obligated and that of a Gentile would be exempted. I want to dwell on that idea for a moment and on the status of Syria as an intermediate territory that it suggests. The graduality goes as follows. The land of Israel is fully obligated in tithes. The territory of chutz la'aretz, outside the land, is exempted. The status of Syria isn't based on some kind of partial obligation, as we have seen before in the context of SHEVI'IT, or as appears in other cases. Rather, its intermediacy takes effect only in that it is able to be considered either here, if it belongs to an Israelite, or there, if it belongs to a Gentile. In other words, there are only two halakhic concrete options here. And the conceptual division between the territories is, in essence, a dichotomy between the land of Israel and what is outside of it. Within this dichotomy, lands in Syria could dynamically be considered on either side as if having an on-off button in the Jewishness of its owner. Other sources take this concept forward in interesting directions. Here, for instance, is the next passage in the Tosefta. An Israelite who purchased a field in Syria, even if he subsequently sold it to a Gentile, it remains obligated in tithes and SHEVI'IT, since it has been already obligated. This source proclaims that the status of the land in Syria as a Jewish one, after it is bought by an Israelite, is irreversible. In other words, there is only an on button, not an off one. In this light, the issue of Jewish ownership in Syria is understood to be not as a mere technical criterion in the context of ties, obligations, or SHEVI'IT prohibitions, but as part of an expansion process of the land of Israel, and as one of the versions of what was held by those who came from Babylon, a criterion which we now see how dynamic may be. According to this model, provincial Syria in its entirety, which stretches as far as the Euphrates in the northern Amanus range, carries the potential of being part of the land of Israel. And this potential is activated when it is first bought into Jewish possession. But in contrast to the boundaries in earlier times, which have been determined by conquests or political control, the sanctity of the land now expands by private ownership of land. The holding of the land as a halakhic criterion, according to this model, is privatized. And the boundaries of the land of Israel may now expand whenever a real estate contract is signed. This transition is best articulated in a passage from the Palestinian Talmud, the YERUSHALMI. The passage is brought as an interpretation to the Mishnah from SHEVI'IT discussed above that refers to what was held by those who came from Babylon and from Egypt. The Talmud distinguishes between these two eras and highlights the difference between them in terms of occupying the land. That is what is written. And the Lord your God will bring you into the land that your fathers possessed, that you may possess it. Your possession has been compared to the possession of your fathers. And he will make you transcend and surpass your fathers. Your fathers had been exempted and became obligated. Also you had been exempted and became obligated. Your fathers did not carry the burden of the empire, but you, despite carrying the burden of the empire. Your fathers became obligated only after acquiring it all, but you, each first one, acquires and becomes obligated. This passage interprets a verse from Deuteronomy 30, verse 5, that describes Israel's return to their land from exile, here in blue. And the Lord, your God, will bring you into the land that your fathers possessed, that you may possess it, and he will make you transcend and surpass your fathers. From the rabbi's perspective, this prophecy is understood to be speaking of their own days, the era that started with the return from the exile in Babylon. In this context, the biblical promise that the possession of the land will surpass that of their fathers who came from Egypt seems outrageous. Clearly, the Jewish control in their days under Rome was much narrower in terms of territory, in far as could be from the military and political dominance of the region in David's days. Here lies the innovation of this Amoraic interpretation, which has to do with the concept of private ownership that turns the biblical promise on its head. The possession of the land in rabbinic times is superior precisely in that it takes effect even without real control. The fathers acquired the land through conquest and sovereignty, whereas we, under Rome, acquire it through buying parts of it individually. This is a dramatic conceptual shift in the perception of Jewish occupation of the land and of the territory's Jewishness, which reflects, to a large extent, the rabbi's self-definition as a conquered community. Before concluding, there is one more point with regard to the private ownership criterion, the last chapter in the narrative in Amoraic times, which I would like to shortly lay out. As I have stressed, contrary to how Lieberman and many scholars that followed his footsteps understood it, in Tannaitic sources, the criterion of Jewish private ownership is restricted only to Syria. It was signified in several sources as what defines Syria as an intermediate territory. That is, that lands that belong to Israelites there are obligated in tithes as if they were part of the land of Israel. However, the last passage from the YERUSHALMI that we read depicts this concept as an essential characteristic of Israel's occupation of the land of Israel, and as part of a larger historiographical narrative. According to this passage, and as indicated in other sources in the YERUSHALMI as well, this concept would apply to the land of Israel in its entirety, not only to lands in Syria. In other words, the basic status of the land of Israel has been perceived in Amoraic times, not in Tannaitic times, as fundamentally deriving from it being in Jewish private hands. Moreover, in the YERUSHALMI, a new halakhic opinion arises, according to which Gentiles' fields inside the land of Israel itself are exempted from tithes. Or as the YERUSHALMI puts it, that a Gentile does have acquisition in the land of Israel to exempt it from tithes. This opinion, despite not being the only opinion, there is a debate over it, is brought up in several discussions in the YERUSHALMI, and it influences how early sources are interpreted in it. It seems to present a mirroring concept to the private ownership criterion in Syria. Just as fields that belong to Israelites in Syria are obligated in tithes, so are fields that belong to Gentiles in the land of Israel exempted. Thus, I argue, we are able to identify a diachronic conceptual evolution with regard to this idea. At first, in Tannaitic times, private ownership has been used to signify Syria's intermediate status. At a later stage, in Amoraic times, this tool had been turned inside and became a criterion to determine the status of lands in the land of Israel itself. According to the model in its later version, the whole region, lands around Antioch as those around Sepphoris at the heart of the Galilee, are all defined by a single symmetric principle. In addition, this version brings to an end the process of privatization of ethnic occupation as a defining criterion for the land's boundaries and its sanctity. Note that a land defined this way would not necessarily compose a continuous territory. Thus, the land of Israel becomes the collection of lands belonging to some Israelites, rather than a single territory belonging to the entire people known collectively as Israel. To conclude, in this lecture, I attempted to characterize some of the primary principles of the halakhic approach towards Syria in rabbinic literature. As I have shown, the voices in this respect are quite diverse, and the picture isn't simple as often displayed. Throughout the rabbinic corpus, and occasionally within a single compound source, we find different gradual models that construct the territory of Syria as an intermediate one, and various interpretive, conceptual, and systemization developments, all of which add up and seem to reflect what we may call a halakhic turbulence with regard to the status of the dominant neighboring territory north of the Jewish Galilee. Particularly intriguing amongst these models is the principle of Jewish private land ownership as a criterion to determine the status of the land. As I have argued, a careful examination of the corpus reveals that this criterion has developed over time and was used in different ways. In Tannaitic literature, it is used to define Syria as an intermediate territory, almost exclusively in the field of tithes. In later times, so it seems, this principle was amplified and became an essential component in defining the status of the land of Israel in its entirety, part of how Amoraic rabbis generally conceived of Jewish territoriality in their era under Rome. In that sense, in my eyes, this nuanced halakhic shift is reflective, from the rabbinic perspective, of the unification of Palestine as part of the Syrian region, and of the fate of memory of Jewish sovereignty and its boundaries. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting. Before we get to the questions, I thought that I would just share some of what I heard that I thought was particularly interesting, new, and so on in your talk. It's really, what you're showing us, I think, is these, you call them different models, and what they really are all of the messy ways that the rabbis are trying to define a land that is complicated. And so just to highlight some of the ideas that you brought to us today, right? This idea of, on the one hand, they have texts that have defined boundaries, and on the other hand, they have these gradual boundaries with different statuses. So they have both of those, both in Tannaitic sources, in different Tannaitic sources, but they exist in that way. And then in other sources, this idea that boundaries are determined by landmarks versus by demographics, or by territory versus historiography. And even that complication exists like within a single discussion of the land. And then also with land that's within a particular boundary, then can also be either owned by Israelites, not owned by Israelites, and have different statuses. And so I think that's such a really interesting way of thinking about space, and not thinking of what are the boundaries, but actually sort of what's like the conceptual architecture, like what models are they using? And the answer is that they're using lots of different models. And my first question really stems from that, which is, on the one hand, a desire for dichotomy, and on the other hand, like an acknowledgement that dichotomy doesn't represent the land, it doesn't represent the people, it doesn't represent the history. And it's an idea, I think, that we see often in rabbinic sources, and maybe even it's something that rabbinic sources grapple with in ways that are new and unique to their predecessors, which is sort of comfort with the in-between and with the undefined. Like they want to define it, but they don't want to define it always. And so two other examples that come to mind. So you brought out the territory example really well. Another that comes to mind is the question of Samaritans and Sadducees, and where the rabbis are really asking questions, the same kinds of questions they're asking about the land. They're asking about different groups of people, ethnic groups, religious groups, and saying, are Samaritans Israel or not Israel? And the answer is, it depends on what practice and for what purpose. And I think that we see that in the sources that you brought today. Another example is gender. So there are men, there are women, but then there are all these people who don't actually comfortably fit into either of those categories that the rabbis discuss, and they're comfortable with that too, right? And so when it comes to circumcision, there are certain things that happen, and when it comes to other things, other rules apply. And so I'm curious to sort of hear you reflect a little bit about how the rabbinic sources about space and territory that you brought to us today sort of fit with this really larger, like, intellectual orientation to the world and like to the messiness of the world that I think actually is a really contemporary question as well. Like, people are asking these questions now as well. So I wanted to start with that because I thought it was really striking.
Yes, thank you. So I totally agree with you. I think it really is, we should see it in the whole context of the rabbinic project, you can call it, or and also worth mentioning, I think, is the recent book of Moshe Halbertal about the doubt as a concept that characterizes rabbinic thought in contrast to earlier Judaism, where just the thought of doubt of something that is not here or there wouldn't be acceptable, right? And the rabbis they not only acknowledge the intermediacy of conceptual intermediacy, but celebrated. It becomes like an issue that is discussed largely and fills full masechtot in the Mishnah. For instance, DEMAI, which I care about very much. Yeah, I totally agree. I think we can also see it with the Syria. I sometimes grapple if to see diachronic evolution within these sources. Like you can see discussions about or dichotomy between Israel, the land of Israel, and outside the land, Aretz and Chutz La'aretz, and then you can see like a second floor added to it, and someone brings in, wait a minute, what about Syria? And it seems like an addition to the text, textually speaking, but I do think conceptually that this is what is happening here, that the dichotomy is turned to a trichotomy.
So I want to ask a few questions that our listeners are asking that are historical and practical, and then I want to sort of expand out to bigger questions. So the first question is, what do rabbinic sources say, if anything, about territories further away that are owned by Jews, sort of beyond the boundaries that they discuss in the sources that you bring? That's one question. While you think about it, I'll ask another, which is, do we know how extensive Jewish land ownership was in Syria during the Tannaitic and Amoraic times? Sort of like, what are we talking about in terms of either numbers or percentages?
Yes, so the first question, I don't recall a source that deals with Jewish ownership abroad, like in Chutz La'aretz, further away from Syria. But I hope I'm not missing anything. I don't recall it anyway. Regarding the second question, what we know, I think as many things in antiquity is very limited. We do know that many Jews lived in Syria. We do have in the Talmud several stories or anecdotes that involve rabbinic Jews, that is, because they are in touch with the rabbis in Palestine, that own lands and sometimes don't know what to do regarding tithes or other obligations of land, and they rent it out to Gentiles. And the sources are all also concerned with the opposite, that Jews rent out, rent Gentile lands over there, and what exactly is the halakhic status in that case? But I don't think we can know more than that about ownership. Yeah, we do know about the land of Israel itself, that their rabbis are concerned, specifically in the YERUSHALMI, of the land being in Gentile hands. That's how they put it. That Rov Eretz Yisrael bidei goyim, meaning that most of it is owned by Gentiles. At least one of the opinions in the Talmud holds that.
One question that I had was about what's going on in the Roman Empire within this territory at the time. So both politically in terms of land administration, sort of over the course of, from the 1st to the 4th or 5th century, sort of how is Roman administration of the land changing? Does that sort of fit into any of the rabbinic discussions? Like, do they reflect on it in explicit ways? Is it something that you sort of sense in sources in more implicit ways? And then sort of expanding out, but sticking with Roman stuff for a moment, about Roman conceptions of land and territory. And I'm just wondering, are these rabbinic reconceptualizations of the land in dialogue with, are they participating in sort of reconceptualization of land? And I could imagine, like, with this idea of imperial expansion, territorial expansion, and there's really interesting stuff that goes on in Roman discussions about sort of blending the historiographic history with the territorial expansion. So I'm curious, sort of in a really practical, sort of legal, administrative sense, and then also in like a conceptual, philosophical sense, like how do we place the rabbinic sources?
Yeah, so I think sometimes they go hand in hand, the practical sense and the theoretical historic one. I find this fascinating, this idea. And I actually dealt with it a little bit in my dissertation. What I found is that the rabbis turn, when they try to reconceptualize Gentile ownership inside the land of Israel, what they turn to is different models of partial ownership of the land. Namely that a Gentile could be an owner, a partial owner of the land of Israel, but not a full owner. He can't fully own it. The real owner is still the Israelite that sold it to him, in a sense, which I think is in dialogue with some Roman concepts, specifically the Roman concept that two actually sides of the same coin in Roman law, that on the one hand, territories in provinces are considered to be imperial land in a sense, either belong to the Roman people or to the emperor, and they are, when conquered, and they are given to private owners only in some sort of private ownership structures, on the one hand. On the other hand, lands in Italy could be only owned by Roman citizens, not by Peruini. And I find it interesting that the Jewish discussion regarding the land of Israel and the option that a Gentile who is not the Jewish citizen, let's say, could fully own the land. So they turn to the same kind of partial ownership and sometimes even use the same terms. I think it's fascinating, yes.
Yeah, that's amazing. I'm curious, sort of looking across the river into Jordan. I'm curious to know about what evidence there is for the visualization and depiction of the land. So what I have in mind is Madaba and the Madaba map, and I realize it's a little bit late especially for the Tannaitic sources, even for the Amoraic. But I'm curious to know, are there visual sources that are helpful, or that give us a little bit of a sense of how people in the region, whether they were rabbis or not, sort of visualized their land, or is that just something that's out of reach?
So as far as I know, we don't have any maps, except for the map or later maps. The first map that I know of the Jewish map of the land of Israel and its area is 10th century. There may have been earlier, but we don't have them. And not only that, I think we don't have any sources that tell us that they used maps, except maybe for one, I think that they speak of using a straw to draw a line in the sea or something. But other than that, I don't think we know. I think what is very evident, outstanding in the sources, some of which we saw today, is the fact that they speak of borders mostly in terms of cities on the line, like a linear image that I think maybe has to do with the human experience of travel in the time, that when moving from one territory to another, you would just walk the road and the cities would be the border lines, but they're border points, not border lines. And I think it has to do also, again, to Roman concept of space, as scholars have shown, that many maps in the Roman world were in fact itineraries of roads and dots on the roads, as if the image is a subway map. That the space was actually road and the way to get to different cities.
That actually brings me right to the next thing that I wanted to ask you, which is about cities in particular, and two questions. On the one hand, what do you make, or how does this fit in the idea of some cities being more dangerous than other cities, depending on sort of the population that lives in the city, whether it's these discussions come up in like the prayer for travel. So getting like, do you say the prayer for travel when you come into the city, when you go out along the road? How does that work? And then the question of sanctification and how that fits into rabbinic discussions of boundaries and the land, this idea that we have already in the Mishnah, and this gets back to this idea of sort of the messy categorization that the land of Israel is sanctified, but certain cities in the land have different statuses of sanctity, and then also this idea of sort of the increased sanctity as you get nearer and nearer to the temple and the Holy of Holies. So I'm curious both about sort of the sociological side of cities, and then also the sanctification, which I think also, as you say, like they're not separate, because what makes a city holy is often the people who occupy it. So I'm curious to know how that fits in.
Yeah, I don't remember sources that speak of specific cities in that sense of being dangerous or being sanctified more than others, besides, of course, YERUSHALMI, Jerusalem, and the Temple Mount, which is an image of circles of sanctity, right? The land is sanctified, and then Jerusalem is sanctified, and the area of the temple, and so on. Yeah, but I think the opposite is very present, which is cities that are considered impure because of Gentile presence, which has to do, it's a question of exactly how it has to do, but it has to do with the general impurity of outside the land of Israel, Tumat Eretz Amim, what it's called. And we do have discussions in specific cities, Ashkelon, for instance, whether they are impure or pure. And you could, there are stories about rabbis that went there and bought there in the market, which we can infer that it's pure and so on. But I think it basically has to do with Gentile presence in those specific cities.
Yeah, I think the one text that I was thinking about is Mishnah KELIM, where cities that have a wall are more holy than the land itself. So somehow, I don't know, like that either urban cities or protected cities or old cities, I don't know exactly where that comes from, but you're right, it doesn't fit the model of ascending towards Jerusalem, which is why it's just like, it reminds me a little bit of the way you talk about like land within the land of Israel that's owned either by Jews or not Jews, and that it sort of upsets a little bit the boundaries. We have one question of clarification about what you said regarding the land of Israel as the land of Israelites. I think that's such a neat concept. Can you just explain it a little bit more?
Sure. Yeah. So what I meant is that in the later version of the private ownership criterion, what I call, which means that we now perceive the land of Israel or the expansion of the land of Israel only by Israelites that own specific fields within the region. We then leave the model of a continuous territory, and we can, or we actually, I think, most plausibly will have um, just a collection of small bits of territories which are owned by Jews, Israelites. And then this collection is now the land that is obligated in tithes, for instance, considered the land of Israel in terms of its obligations, its halakhic implications. So it becomes like this collection of different lands and not a continuous one.
I wanted to ask you about the distinction in the sources between eating things from a particular land and not being allowed to cultivate the land.
Mm-hmm.
And it led me to think about the idea that when we talk about sabbatical years, for example, on the one hand, we're talking about letting the land rest. And on the other hand, we're talking about letting the people of the land rest, right? And the distinction between what can be eaten and what can be cultivated, I think really gets at that. And so I was curious actually about how that works. Why are certain areas where you can eat the produce from those places, but you can't cultivate? Like, it almost seems like the sabbatical year in those instances are more about making sure that Israelites don't cultivate, like don't work, take a sabbatical, as opposed to the land taking a sabbatical. And I'm curious if that's like how that fits in to sort of the history of Shemitah, sabbatical years in general. Like, where does human labor fit in? Like, it fits in so well for Shabbat every week, but how does it fit into the 7-year cycle?
Okay, so first of all, I'm not sure of how to understand that source, that specific source, the distinction between eaten and cultivated, nechal v'nevad, and different interpretations that have been suggested to specifically to nechal. Why is it eaten? What is the problem with eating the fruit there? So some suggestions are because nechal, after it was supposed to be extinguished in the sabbatical year, and others go to nechal in terms of the sanctity of the fruits of the sabbatical year, which is a different direction. I'm not sure how to understand it that truly. But generally speaking, I think the Shemitah, I think in rabbinic sources, is more about the land than about the people. Yeah, I think in most aspects of the Shemitah, people are not allowed to work because of the land, not because of the people needing to rest. And I think that's, yeah, it's quite different than Shabbat.
So the idea that you can eat things that grow on trees without cultivation, but specifically working the land is what's like that they're, in a way, what it means to let the land rest itself has these different degrees.
Right. Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Like to lay fallow is not the same as not cultivating, right? That you can actually pick things. You just can't sort of abuse the land in the way that you would every other year or something like that.
Yeah.
So we only have a couple minutes left, so I want to conclude with 2 questions. The first is a question that that I'm really interested in, which is the interplay between space and time in the sources that you showed us. So you highlighted the historiographical background as the determining status of land and boundaries in some cases, and then Jewish land ownership as a temporal criterion, right? Like this idea of the status changes at a point in history and then they're on. And so I'm curious just to ask you to reflect a little bit. I know in your work on periodization, space played such a big role, right? That the history of like the past, the present, and the future are very much about a space and what status the space has. And so I'm curious to know sort of how you might articulate the temporal dimension of the territorial discussion.
Wow, I have to think about that. I must say that during your introduction, I realized that it really has to do more with one another than I thought, my two projects. And I have to think about that. I will say that on the time side of it, what the Christian argument against Judaism was that Judaism's being defined by a space, mostly by the temple, but not only the temple, also that there are obligations that are only restricted to the land of Israel, is a sign of Israel's being restricted in time. And that the destruction of the temple and the devastation of the Jewish land now is a proof, or not only a proof, but also a reason to the breaking of the covenant with Israel and turning to a new era. And I do think you're right. It's a deeper interplay than what I thought it is, and it's worth thinking about more seriously.
And the last question is really just like a reflective question, which is about the way in which contemporary conceptions of territory inform your work, are informed by your work. And you know, I'm sitting here in New York, and I was thinking about the ways, like the many messy ways that we here in North America think about space. So on the one hand, we have like the United States of America that's made up of all these different states, and that there are boundaries, but you can cross between them, but taxes are different and land ownership is different. And then we have North America, and we have Canada, and we have Mexico. And in many, like there are lots of discussions about borders and what those borders are and how they matter or whether they matter. And then we also have things like NAFTA and like the trade agreements. And so for some purposes, there are no boundaries, and for other purposes, there are. And so, you know, goods might not need to like show the same paperwork as people, and all sorts of things like that. And of course, the pandemic has sort of highlighted, I think, the way in which like borders and territories can sort of be reasserted or reimagined in different contexts. And so as I was listening to your talk, I was thinking about that. And I'm curious to know from you sort of how has working on this project been for you sort of in general, like as a modern person living in a particular place, but also during a time where like the conversation about borders changed so much over the course of the past year.
Yeah, I didn't think of it at all in the context of the past year, I must say. Just imagine what it is to work about a Jewish occupation of lands in Jerusalem, in contemporary Jerusalem. But I try, that's just to be honest, I try not to think about it too much. In order to let the sources, you know, have their own space, not to put the burden of our categories and let them be studied as they are, as much as, of course, we are all products of our reality and our culture, but as much as I can. I really try to avoid that.
This is amazing. Thank you so much. We could continue, but we're gonna stop because temporal boundaries themselves are important. But I really want to thank you so much for being here, for sharing your work. And when you when you publish this, send it to us so that we can all read it and think with you. And good luck as you continue.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.